Good morning, students. We're going to begin our study of Chapter 1 into Understanding Lifespan Human Development. This is a brief introduction. This is not meant to take place of textbook or classroom lecture, but just a brief understanding of what this chapter is about. So let's see what our learning objectives are for Chapter 1. This is introduction. So in this brief introduction, we're going to be talking about what is development and how should we think about development. What is the science of lifespan development? And what are influences on development, as well as how do we as psychologists study development? Also, what special challenges do developmental scientists face? These are just some of the things that we will be talking about in Chapter 1. Now, there are 3 goals for studying human development. First, it seeks to describe. In describing, scientists observe behavior and they record characteristics of behavior that they observe. And this is done through what is called descriptive research. Now, the second goal for studying human development is to explain. And by explaining, we want to understand the cause of behavior. And we do this through experimental research. Then, predicting. Scientists can make predictions about when and how behavior will occur once they are able to describe and explain it. And we do this through what is called correlational research. And correlational research is where we look to see if there is a relationship between one variable or another variable to understand some phenomenon. Then the third goal for studying human development is to modify it. This way, scientists study negative behaviors, which help individuals change those behaviors, and it is intended to try to help people make their lives better by changing that behavior. Those are the goals of studying human development: to describe, to explain, predict, and to modify. Now, just as in any discipline, we like to study the history of behavior and how everything evolved. And through these historical perspectives, G. Stanley Hall was one developmental scientist whose primary interests were in evolutionary psychology and child development. And of course, his greatest contribution was to the development and growth of early psychology. And by the year 1898, Hall had supervised 30 out of 54 PhD degrees that had been awarded in the United States. And he was also the first APA president, or American Psychological Association president. He also designed the first lab in the USA that studies development. And the scientific study of human development began with studies of childhood during the 19th century. And at this time, adolescence was not considered a separate phase of development until the 20th century, when scientific interest in aging also began. Then, as researchers became interested in following development through adulthood, lifespan development became a field of study of what we know it to be today. So that is just a brief historical perspective of development. And you will hear G. Stanley Hall's name throughout the text. So how do we define human development? Human development is the pattern of movement or change that begins at conception and it continues throughout the lifespan, which includes growth and decline, and it can be positive or negative. So as humans grow and develop, they're constantly changing. At each level of development, there are new challenges during growth, and we will study those during the various chapters. Human development is always evolving, and developmental scientists study developmental changes, both quantitative, meaning that they use numbers, surveys; qualitative, they study perceptions of what others and opinions, as well as with stability of personality and behavior. So we study personality, we study behavior, and as we seek to understand human development, we're always researching. There are three major areas or domains of development. There's physical development, which includes the growth of the body and the physiological changes that take place within the body. Then there is cognitive development, which has to do with changes in perception, how one thinks, language, how language is acquired, learning, how do we learn? And we'll talk about memory, and we'll talk about information processing. Then there is psychosocial development, which we look at changes in personality and emotions and how one reacts in the environment and with others in groups. Developmental scientists also study moral development, and when we study moral development, we will talk about Kohlberg's theory of moral development and how people reason and make decisions. And there are different ways that people make decisions in adolescence as well as in adulthood. Then there's social development, how one gets along with others, interact in social situations. And then we'll study at that moment Albert Bandura's theory of social cognition. So each of these aspects affects the other and influences the behavior. Next, there are also individual differences in development. There are things that can influence development, such as heredity. What part does heredity play in our environment? Our genes, genetic predispositions, what influence does that have on how one develops and grows? The environment. What influence does the environment have on development? And this is where we talk about the nurture-nature debate. And we will be talking a lot about the nurture-nature debate as we study lifespan this semester. Many typical changes during childhood are related to maturation, growth, and as one's mature, there are a lot of changes that take place. Then their individual differences increase as one grows and gets older. All right. We will talk about the 8 periods of development. The prenatal period, which is from conception to birth, and we'll talk about the changes that take place. Then we'll talk about infancy and toddlerhood, birth to 3 years, and there are different developmental growth changes during that time. The early childhood period, 3 to 6 years of age. Middle of childhood, 6 to 12 years. Adolescence, 12 to 20 years. Young adulthood, 30 to 40 years. And middle adulthood, late adulthood, 65 and up. And in each period, people have characteristic developmental needs and tasks. Now, these ages that are listed here, they vary from textbook to textbook. Depends on the addition and how old and new developments that occur. But they all generally are around the same age periods. And there are different influences on development that we will discuss. We'll talk about ethnicity, how you define it, and what part does ethnicity play in development. Heredity, where we will talk about genes and genetics. Environment, how important that is. Culture, we'll define culture and see what that has to do with how it influences development in different countries. Then we'll talk about the historical context. And influences may be normative, which are age graded or history graded, and we will talk about what that means, or non-normative, and we'll talk about what that means as well. Now, we will talk about Baltes, who was a developmental theorist who said that as people grow, that there are different aspects of development that people go through, that these are just perspectives of development, and you will do an assignment where you will explore these a little bit more in depth, and I will probably do a separate video for you where you will be able to understand these. So briefly, the 6 principles that he describes, he says that development involves both gains and losses. We'll talk about that. Development is lifelong. Development is multiply influence. We'll talk about what that means as well. Development is multidimensional. Development is plastic. Development is multicultural. And we will explore each one of these in depth in a separate video so that you will be able to complete your assignment without difficulty. And we will also talk about another developmental theorist, Urie Bronfenbrenner, in 1979, who was one of the founders of Head Start. He developed family systems where he said that there are different systems within a family that children fit in and that one fit in, that there is the microsystem, the mesosystem, the exosystem, and the macrosystem. And we will not focus in great depth on this, but we will explore each of these terms and systems. So how is development studied? Well, there are various scientific methods used in studying development, and you will do a developmental research design in class, and you will upload that to Blackboard. Scientists use various methods in studying development, qualitative or quantitative research. Again, qualitative, we get perceptions, beliefs, and opinions. Quantitative, we use survey, questionnaire methods, interviews. Scientists use random selection to ensure generalizability, and we will talk about what that means. And then there are 3 forms of data collection. Self-reports, which includes interviews, questionnaires, diaries. And we will talk about the pros and cons of each of these developmental methods. Behavioral and performance measures. How do we measure behavior? And observation is another form of data collection. And we will talk about the pros and cons of each of those. And these are the various research designs that we will talk about in depth, so that when you do your developmental research design, you will be well equipped to select the appropriate design to use. Research designs used in studying development include case studies and ethnographic study, mostly using qualitative designs. Design used to study age-related development, longitudinal, which describes continuity or change in the same participants over time. And then there are advantages and disadvantages to each of these designs. You cross-sectional compare age groups, and only the experiment can establish a causal relationship. We will talk about that. Then there is the sequential design, which is intended to overcome the weaknesses of the other two designs. But there are, as we said, advantages and disadvantages to each of these designs. And then we will talk about ethical issues that researchers must adhere to in developing and conducting proper research. Informed consent, as you learned in introductory, all participants must be informed. Avoidance of deception, and we'll review that. Protection from harm. Participants must not be psychologically or physically harmed. And then they must be debriefed or told about the results of the study, or why the study was being conducted. And then we know that as researchers, we must keep everything in the research study confidential. And we will talk about each of these, and you will do an activity in ethical research. So this is just a brief overview of Chapter 1. And you will have just a short quiz on this that I will ask you to complete. A 10-question quiz on Blackboard. See you in class.